Maduro, cornered, potential reactions. In this final stretch of the electoral race, the Venezuelan regime, led by Nicolás Maduro, finds itself cornered by the results of its own governance. The self-proclaimed revolution he embodies ended up being a machine for generating anguish, unsustainable poverty, and an unprecedented exodus. After a quarter of a century managing one of the richest countries in the world in terms of resources, they have absolutely no success to show, while all indicators of Venezuelans' quality of life only demonstrate a severe deterioration. Paradoxically, the self-proclaimed revolution chose the name of a great liberator of America to engage in taking away personal freedoms, curtailing individual rights, aligning with governments of dubious democratic representation, isolating the country from the rest of the world, and enriching themselves through corruption. The opposite of Simón Bolívar's legacy, handing over the destiny of a country to incapable idealists who were dazzled by a Cuba that proclaimed itself as an alternative ideological beacon, turned out to be very costly. Castro's Cuba ultimately became a true parasite of other countries that always had to economically support its revolution. Someday, it will be known how much Fidel and Raúl Castro stole from Venezuela, skillfully manipulating Hugo Chávez's social resentments and Nicolás Maduro's grand ambitions to finance and try to export their authoritarian 21st century socialism. Venezuela wants to recover, and despite years of tyranny, it doesn't lower its guard in the struggle to overcome the countless obstacles the regime imposes, trying to prevent the people from achieving real electoral representation to win in clean elections. But the Democratic Unity Platform made the unanimous decision to designate Edmundo Gonzales Urrutia as the unitary presidential candidate, and it's such encouraging news celebrated by the majority of the population and also by the international community. It generates genuine hope to see not only the unanimous support of María Corina Machado as the opposition leader, but also to see that all the figures who have been fighting for years to remove a dictatorial regime through the force of popular vote are joining forces, a regime that can no longer present itself under the facade of democracy. But in this scenario of relative optimism, it should not be overlooked that Nicolás Maduro has Venezuela hostage, and like a true captor, he will try to negotiate a ransom and a safe conduct as a condition for handing over the country. It is expected that in this short period remaining until July 28th, hidden negotiations will be opened with different factors of international power, allowing Nicolás Maduro to obtain some guarantee to leave power and avoid imprisonment. This is emphasized because, like in a kidnapping, if no agreement is reached with the kidnapper, he will surely not fulfill the delivery, and that is the most serious risk at the moment. The priority is for Nicolás Maduro to relinquish power. The evidence of an approaching end is increasingly felt within the government, and the internal pressures of the accomplices of the long Bolivarian looting become stronger. As within the same regime, not everyone accepts the reality that they will have to relinquish power, and different, every man for himself alternatives are beginning to be activated. A radical sector of the government considers that the regime should continue by hook or by crook, and nurtures the idea of continuing with the same old tactics. That is, disqualifying any candidate, persecuting opponents, and waging an electoral battle by pushing the rules to the limit and later counting the votes, even if they lose the endorsement of international observers. They have experience in doing so, and a sector intends to do it again. In the last 13 years, more than 1,500 citizens have been disqualified by the National Electoral Council, including figures such as Juan Guaidó, Enrique Capriles, Leopoldo López, María Corina Machado, Corina Lloris, and a list that could continue growing out of fear. It is also known that they have committed electoral fraud by tampering with results in the recount, and although the National Electoral Council does not admit it and even denies it, even the Smartmatic company itself denounced the tampering committed in 2017. The usual fear and cowardice are now compounded by desperation. The plan includes restricting the voting possibilities of all Venezuelans abroad to the maximum, with all sorts of excuses and maneuvers that include limiting service hours or directly closing embassies and consulates, since it is known that every external vote is opposition, so it must be prevented. Internally, they promoted the new law against fascism, approved in the first discussion on April 2nd by the National Assembly Legislature of Venezuela. In the coming weeks, it will move to the second discussion, and since they have the majority, it would be approved. With this legal tool, they plan to urgently initiate an ideological persecution of all opponents and primarily install the necessary distrust so that Venezuelans seeking a change do not believe in transparency and thus reduce voter turnout. In terms of communication, they will try to establish a narrative based on 3 central points to regain some credibility. The first, that the blockade affects but does not condition the country's growth. It can grow. The second, internal corruption was a factor that harmed the economy, but now they will pursue and punish all officials with a request for life imprisonment and recover the funds. And the third, PDVSA projects a substantial growth in production, expanding operational capacity, and increasing oil and gas exports. Nicolás Maduro is forced to be creative, and that is not one of his qualities, nor is it of his surroundings. Furthermore, María Corina Machado has finally managed to lead a process in which she brings together all Venezuelans seeking a change, and every new lie of the regime is a new argument to support Edmundo Gonzales Urrutia. María Corina Machado made a call through social media, showing unity, for people to go out and vote. Her message was clear. She said, "We already have a date, we already have a candidate, and we already have support from around the world."
Hoy faltan 99 días porque ya tenemos fecha, 28 de julio. Ya tenemos tarjeta y ya tenemos un candidato que ha sido apoyado por todo el mundo, por todos los partidos políticos, por los ciudadanos de bien, Edmundo Gonzales Urrutia.
The reality of Venezuela, as expressed in previous reports, is that the country is bankrupt. There are no genuine resources in any sector of its economy. It cannot take on more debt, nor print a currency that has no value. It cannot access the gold reserves in England. Economic sanctions continue. The few resources are consumed by corruption, and it is not enough for everyone. So the government has no choice but to turn against its own people and seek blame for the lack of money. Campaigning without money is not good for any incumbency, and much less for this one that destroyed the entire productive fabric of the country and that bears the commercial sanctions initiated by the Obama administration, deepened by Trump, and continued by Biden, who reduced the size of the Bolivarian loot by 70%. Lying in the Barbados agreement granted them a time frame and some money by lifting part of the sanctions, but also made it clear that, if not for external pressure, there would be no clean elections in Venezuela. The regime's economy went from compromised to directly precarious, as we have already mentioned in detailed reports on Maduro, and if you haven't seen them, we invite you to do so on our channel. 3 well-detailed reports to understand the reality of a people suffering from a corrupt ruling class that has kidnapped their country. At the beginning of 2023, when the corruption scandal of the state oil company PDVSA erupted, the entire environment was involved in a financial web where it was said that $21 billion from public coffers had disappeared. The money never appeared. PDVSA's corruption was already historical, but the drain created by officials was so blatant that they left the regime without money. So they began a purge in which 61 people involved were arrested and subjected to a trial with no major progress. However, in the midst of the scandal, the Minister of Petroleum Tyrant El Aissami only submitted his resignation, published a tweet from his account on March 20th, 2023, and no one heard from him again. He was missing until he was found by Attorney General Tarek William Saab. The Attorney General of Venezuela is very capable when he seeks. he had already managed to find María Corina Machado guilty of sedition and treason to the homeland.
Y pasamos ahora a Venezuela. Allí la Fiscalía General anunció este martes la detención del ex ministro de Petróleo y expresidente de Petróleos de Venezuela, Tyrant El Aissami, por su presunta participación en una trama millonaria de corrupción que comenzó en PDVSA y se habría extendido a otras empresas estatales. La confirmación del arresto se produce tras un año sin conocerse el paradero del exministro. El fiscal general Tarek William Saab anunció la detención del poderoso exministro de Petróleo, el Aissami, quien será imputado por 5 delitos, entre ellos traición a la patria y legitimación de capitales.
The prosecutor announced that the alleged head of the multi-million-dollar corruption scheme in dollars at the PDVSA company finally appeared and presents the case as good news for the regime's faltering image, which thus intends to show its fight against corruption, as we have been expressing. The now detained Tariq Zaidan El Aissami Madar was considered a protected official because he was a key piece in the relationship between Venezuela and Iran. He was always the one who facilitated Iranian operations in Latin America and also served as their bridge in the relationship.
El Aissami es conocido por sus fuertes vínculos con Irán, Hezbollah y otras organizaciones terroristas. De hecho, su padre fue el representante en Venezuela del partido Ba'ath, el mismo de los dictadores Bashar al-Assad y Saddam Hussein. Uno de los hombres fuertes del chavismo y de los más radicalizados, el Aissami es también sospechado por Estados Unidos de tener relaciones con el narcotráfico.
The situation is pressing, time is running out, and there is no money left for everyone. So there will be no resources even for populist emergency measures because economic priority must be given to the military, who are the true guarantee and support of the regime. El Aissami's problem with Maduro has to do with money and business. Tariq El Aissami will have to provide updates on the missing money, or he will be condemned by the regime he served and was part of. The pressure is so strong that the other detainees related to the PDVSA Corruption case are ending up dead by suicide in state custody, such as the case of Colonel Marino José Lugo Aguilar, former director of PDVSA, and a trusted person of El Aissami, who was found hanged in his cell on April 17th last, which is the third case. One committed suicide in April of last year also while in state custody, according to authorities, and another under house arrest due to health issues. Coincidences that send messages in mafia code. Maduro needed dollar availability to face electoral challenges, and El Aissami failed to explain the accounts to him. An electoral campaign without money to deliver to the people is a guaranteed failure, and Maduro is desperate to reverse his dark ending in some way. With El Aissami imprisoned, he intends to offer a valuable trophy to the international press and convince Chavistas, who are disenchanted, but still believe that the country's problems are all due to the blockade and a probable corruption that may exist. Maduro exhibits him handcuffed, surrounded by security agents, on his way to an exemplary trial and ensuring that he will go to the end in the fight against corruption. The reality of the Venezuelan government today resembles that of any criminal gang in the world. They allow members to commit crimes to earn their income. But as the funds run out, the leader is preserved, and those who are dispensable are eliminated. The possibility of continuing to assert to the world that Venezuela is a constitutional democracy is increasingly complicated because there is no internal popular support. The population abhors them and is convinced that they cannot get the country out of the situation they got it into. On the contrary, they would aggravate it. So this time, they are not willing to tolerate more maneuvers or fraud. The rest of the countries in the region had been tolerating the lie of Venezuela's democratic facade because there were progressive governments that remained silent for convenience or some complicity. But the winds of change in Latin America are exposing that certain recipes failed miserably, and those who continue to support them do so against the will of the people who are now looking at new ideas to guarantee economic advancement and commercial interdependencies with the rest of the world. Only presidents like Colombia's Gustavo Petro, Nicaragua's Daniel Ortega, or Cuba's Miguel Díaz-Canel can support Maduro's regime because even Brazil's Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva no longer endorses certain positions of restriction on free elections, and Chile's Gabriel Boric, despite being a socialist, cannot hide the bad relationship he is having with Maduro's attitudes. The left in the continent is distancing itself from the situation in Venezuela. Even former Uruguayan socialist president José Pepe Mujica has let go and openly questions it. For the rest of the continent, Nicolás Maduro is simply a dictator usurping a position through fraud. Any victory for Maduro is a defeat for the democratic world. But this time, he has no means to simulate a fraudulent new victory, so other fears arise that must be anticipated to preemptively address. We must not be naive in this complex situation of reaching the end of tyranny in the best possible way. The magnitude of crimes, some of them crimes against humanity, committed by the regime in recent years, place Maduro in a situation of facing trial and receiving a sure conviction, so the reality of a transition situation must be considered. Nicolás Maduro will never be a former president who will travel the world giving lectures or a reference for consultation for other leaders. He will be a fugitive criminal. Chile managed to emerge from 17 years of military dictatorship under Augusto Pinochet by granting him the position of lifetime senator, which assured him a decorous retirement and impunity until his death. Probably the example is not the most appropriate, but the idea is to present the problem as it is. A dictator does not leave office, and that's it. Maduro kidnapped Venezuela and will behave like a true cornered kidnapper. In Argentina, the dictatorship preferred to start a war to try to raise patriotic sentiment and retain power in 1982, rather than calling elections and making an orderly democratic transition. The result was disastrous.
Que sepa el mundo, América, que un pueblo con voluntad, pueblo argentino, si quieren venir, que vengan, les presentaremos batalla.
It is not far-fetched for a desperate Nicolás Maduro to mobilize more military forces towards the Essequibo and, in violation of international law, start a conflict with Guyana to use it as an excuse and suspend elections due to external threats.
Y en Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro aprobó una ley para anexarse la región del Esequibo, un área que representa alrededor de 2/3 del territorio de Guyana. Un contexto que se da tras las denuncias por parte del mandatario acerca de presuntas bases militares secretas estadounidenses en la región. Maduro asegura que Washington tiene en esta zona rica en petróleo núcleos del Comando Sur y de la CIA, unas células que según el régimen fueron concebidas para preparar agresiones a la población del sur y del oriente de Venezuela y provocar así una escalada contra su gobierno. Desde que el país celebrara un controvertido referéndum en diciembre sobre este tema, esta nueva medida del gobierno genera temores sobre una posible invasión de Venezuela a la vecina Guyana.
Another option is that if he does not achieve sufficient guarantees to relinquish power, even after losing the elections, he openly declares himself a dictator and does not recognize the result. He is in communication with Russia and Iran to assist him, since Cuba's situation will mirror Venezuela's fate, and no advice from them will hold any value. According to journalistic information, Maduro has scheduled a visit to the Kremlin, and another alternative is that perhaps he goes and forgets to return. Everything is possible in a dictator who needs impunity. We already had a similar situation in Latin America when in November of 2000, the then president of Peru, Alberto Fujimori, while being accused of corruption, traveled to an international summit and ended up staying in Japan, from where he sent his formal resignation to the Congress of the Republic by fax.
Fujimori renunció por un fax. De ese nivel estamos hablando. O sea, un presidente de la República que se va a un viaje a Japón y en Japón renuncia a la presidencia con un fax. En ese tiempo no había WhatsApp.
I feel very much that my resignation as the president of the Republic of Peru has been done here in Japan.
The opportunity to remove Maduro from power is the priority of the Venezuelan people. So we ask all those who are able to go out and vote, because this time they have every chance of winning power and recovering the management of their country. They must do it.
Por eso hoy más que nunca te necesitamos. Necesitamos que todos los venezolanos dentro y fuera del país formemos parte de la gran plataforma 600K para garantizar que cada voto cuente. Que formes parte de la gran alianza nacional Gana para transformar a Venezuela.
Afterward, in a second phase, the time for justice and internal pacification will come. We will closely follow this complex electoral process that has the entire region on edge. So we invite you to subscribe, and whoever can, to support us on our independent channel. And to all Venezuelans, we ask, do not forget on July 28, 2024, to do the important task that will improve your situation and quality of life. It will be a historic day.